The world thinks it knows how Elvis Presley died. It was August 16th, 1977. The place was Graceland. The official cause was a heart attack, a cardiac arrhythmia. Simple, tidy, but the story of a life as big as Elvis's rarely ends with a simple, tidy sentence. The truth is often found in the quiet moments before the end. In the words spoken, or maybe just thought. There are the official last words, the ones recorded for history. But there are also the whispers, the rumors, the phrases he might have said that hint at the man behind the legend. A man struggling with fame, with his health, with loneliness. A man searching for something he could never quite name. We are going to look at 17 of those alleged last words. Some are documented, some are speculation. Each one is a key. A key to a room in the sprawling mansion of his final days. A key to understanding the king in his final hour. What was really on his mind? Was he looking for an escape? Was he ready for the end? Or was he just a man hoping to make it to the next morning? Number 17, was this a code for something more? I'm going to the bathroom to read. These are the most famous last words of Elvis Presley. The ones everyone agrees on. His fiancée, Ginger Alden, reported them. She was in the master bedroom at Graceland in the early hours of August 16th, 1977. Elvis couldn't sleep. It was a familiar problem. He got up from the bed. He told her where he was going. It was a simple domestic moment, the kind of thing millions of people say every day. But with Elvis, nothing was ever that simple. The act itself seems mundane. A man can't sleep, so he decides to read. But this was Elvis, the man who couldn't go to a public library, the man who lived in a self-contained bubble. His reading was not casual. It was a deep, obsessive search. For years, he had been devouring books on religion, spirituality, and the occult. As Larry Geller, his personal hairstylist and spiritual confidant, kept him supplied with an endless stream of texts. 2 books about Hinduism, theosophy, numerology, and Christian mysticism filled his shelves. On that last night, the book he took with him was reportedly The Scientific Search for the Face of Jesus by Franco Adams. A book about the Shroud of Turin. Think about that. In his final moments of consciousness, he wasn't reading a novel or a newspaper. He was reading a book trying to scientifically prove the image of Jesus Christ. This wasn't light reading to pass the time. This was a mission. He had been on this mission for years. He told friends he wanted to find God. He wanted to understand his purpose. He felt his talent was a gift from a higher power, and he felt the weight of that gift. Peter Guralnick, in his definitive biography, Careless Love, the Unmaking of Elvis Presley, paints a portrait of a man profoundly isolated by his fame. Reading was one of the few ways he could travel outside the walls of Graceland. It was his escape, but it was also his work. He would underline passages, make notes in the margins, and discuss the ideas for hours with anyone who would listen. He was looking for answers. He was looking for a way to make sense of his extraordinary and often painful life. So when he said, "I'm going to the bathroom to read," was it just a statement of fact? Or was it something else? The bathroom was his sanctuary. It was one of the few places he could be truly alone, away from the constant presence of his entourage, the Memphis Mafia. It was a place of privacy in a life that had none. Going there to read was a ritual. It was his version of meditation. It was his way of trying to connect with something bigger than himself. The phrase itself is so plain, so normal, and maybe that's the most cryptic part of it all. This larger-than-life figure, this global icon, reduced his final communication to a simple household announcement. It was as if, in the end, he was just a man seeking a moment of peace and quiet. And a man with a book, hoping to find an answer in its pages before the sun came up. But what we still do not know is haunting. What specific passage was he looking at when his heart failed? Did he find the answer he was looking for in those final silent moments? Or did the words on the page simply blur into darkness, leaving the greatest question of all unanswered? Number 16, was this his final promise? Okay, I won't. Just before Elvis said he was going to the bathroom to read, Ginger Alden said something to him. She was concerned. She knew his habits. She knew he sometimes nodded off in strange places at strange times. According to her book, Elvis and Ginger, she said, "Don't fall asleep in there." His reply was simple, 2 words. "Okay, I won't." This was more than just a casual exchange. It was a conversation about his health. It was a promise he couldn't keep. Elvis's life in his final years was a battle against his own body. He was in constant pain from a host of ailments. His colon, his liver, his blood pressure. He had glaucoma in one eye. He had twisted ankles and aching joints. And to deal with the pain and the grueling schedule of performing, he took medication. Lots of it. Dr. George Nicopolis, known as Dr. Nick, was Elvis's personal physician. He traveled with him everywhere. He was the man who prescribed the drugs. In the years after Elvis's death, Dr. Nick would be put on trial, accused of overprescribing. He was acquitted, but the controversy never went away. The toxicology report from Elvis's autopsy found 14 different drugs in his system, 10 in significant quantities: codeine, Valium, morphine, Demerol, and a cocktail of barbiturates. The issue was not just pain, it was sleep. Elvis had completely turned his life upside down. He slept all day and was awake all night. This was a habit he started early in his career to avoid the mobs of fans. But by 1977, it was a prison. To get to sleep, he needed sleeping pills. To wake up for a show, he needed stimulants. His body was in a constant state of chemical warfare. Falling asleep wasn't a gentle drift into unconsciousness. It was a crash, and it could happen anywhere. So when Ginger said, "Don't fall asleep in there," she was talking about this reality. She had likely seen him nod off while eating, while talking, while sitting in a chair. The fear was that he would fall asleep in the bathroom, slump over, and hurt himself. Or worse, his promise, "Okay, I won't," was his reassurance to her. But it was also a sign of his own awareness. He knew his body was not his own to control anymore. He knew he was walking a tightrope. This promise highlights the deep denial that surrounded Elvis. Everyone in his inner circle knew he was sick. The book, Elvis What Happened, written by 3 of his former bodyguards, Red West, Sonny West, and Dave Hebler, had been published just weeks before his death and exposed the truth about his drug use and his rages. Elvis was devastated by it. He saw it as a betrayal, but he also couldn't face the truth it contained. He and his circle insisted he didn't have a problem. He just needed the medicine for his health issues. His promise to Ginger was part of that denial. A small, brave, but ultimately futile attempt to pretend he was in control. He wasn't a drug addict in the typical street sense. He was, as Priscilla Presley later described it, a man who overused prescription drugs under a doctor's care. But the result was the same. His body was breaking down. That final promise was a tiny act of defiance against the inevitable. He was saying, "I'm still in charge." But he wasn't. The chemicals and the years of abuse were. And so we are left with the chilling questions. Did he believe his own promise? Was it a lie to comfort her, or a lie to comfort himself? And what if he had been too tired to even make that promise? Would Ginger have insisted he stay in the bedroom, potentially changing the course of history with a single worried command? Number 15. Was he dreaming of a different ending? "I'm sick of being Elvis." This is a sentiment, not a direct quote from his last day. But it's a phrase he reportedly said many times, in many ways, to his closest friends. It was the cryptic summary of his final chapter. He was trapped. Trapped in a gold lame jumpsuit. Trapped by the expectations of his fans. Trapped by the financial machine that Colonel Tom Parker had built around him. By 1977, the routine was grinding him down. Las Vegas residencies, tours of the same cities, singing the same songs. The thrill was gone. The famous 1973 Aloha from Hawaii concert was a global triumph, broadcast by satellite to over 1 billion people. It was a peak. But after the peak, there's only one way to go. The shows that followed, especially in the last year, were often sad affairs. He was overweight, bloated, and sometimes incoherent. He would forget lyrics. He would ramble on stage. The reviews were often brutal. He knew it. He dreamed of something else. He wanted to be a serious actor. This wasn't a new dream. It was the dream he'd had in the 1950s, before the army and before the string of terrible formulaic movies the Colonel forced him into. He saw himself in the mold of Marlon Brando or James Dean. In 1976, he was offered a role that could have changed everything. Barbra Streisand wanted him to co-star in her remake of A Star is Born. The role was a rock star on the decline. It was a part he could have inhabited completely. It was a chance to show the world the real actor that was hiding inside him. He was desperate to do it. Jerry Schilling, a key member of the Memphis Mafia and a lifelong friend, acted as the go-between. The negotiations were intense, but Colonel Parker killed the deal. He demanded top billing for Elvis, above Streisand. He demanded an outrageous salary. His demands were so impossible that the studio had no choice but to walk away. The part went to Chris Christopherson. The movie was a massive hit. Elvis was heartbroken. He felt it was his last chance. Being Elvis had become a job. A very well-paying job, but a job nonetheless. The man, Elvis Presley, was disappearing. He wanted to produce films. He wanted to study martial arts in a monastery. He wanted to read his books and talk about God. He wanted to be a normal father to his daughter, Lisa Marie. But he had to be Elvis. The machine demanded it. The colonel had debts, rumored to be from gambling. The entourage had salaries. Graceland had bills. So the tours had to continue, whether he was well enough to perform or not. The phrase, "I'm sick of being Elvis," is the ultimate cry of the prisoner in the gilded cage. He had everything the world could offer: money, fame, adoration, but he didn't have freedom. He didn't have the freedom to fail, the freedom to change, or the freedom to simply stop. On his last day, he was preparing for another tour, due to start in Portland, Maine, on August 17th. He was trapped on a treadmill, and he knew it. His sickness was not just physical. It was a sickness of the soul. This leaves us with profound questions. If Colonel Parker had let him make A Star is Born, would it have saved him? Would a creative rebirth have given him a new reason to live, to get healthy? Or was the persona of Elvis so powerful by then that not even he could escape it? Was he doomed to be a prisoner of his own creation, no matter what? Number 14. Who was he really looking for? Mama. The name of his mother, Gladys Presley. It's not confirmed that he spoke her name on his last night. But for anyone who knew Elvis, her name was always on his lips, always in his heart. It was the first and last word of his emotional vocabulary. To understand Elvis's end, you have to understand his relationship with his mother. It was the central, defining relationship of his life. Gladys died on August 14th, 1958. Elvis was 23 years old and serving in the U.S. Army in Germany. He was granted emergency leave to fly home to Memphis, but he arrived just hours before she passed away from a heart attack, her health ruined by diet pills and alcohol. He was utterly destroyed. At her funeral, he sobbed uncontrollably, crying out, "Everything I have is gone." In many ways, he never recovered from her death. They had an incredibly close, almost telepathic bond. He was her only surviving child. His twin brother, Jesse Garon, was stillborn. And Gladys poured all of her love, her hopes, and her fears into her son. She worried about him constantly. When he became famous, she was terrified. She hated the screaming crowds. She hated that he was so far away. And Elvis, in turn, worshipped her. He bought her a pink Cadillac. He bought her Graceland. But he could never give her peace of mind, and he could never get her back. Throughout his life, he talked to her. He visited her grave at all hours of the night, lying on the grass and speaking to her for hours. Many of his spiritual explorations were, at their core, an attempt to reconnect with Gladys. He read books about the afterlife, about communication with spirits, all in the hope that he could find her again. He felt she was watching over him. When things went wrong, he would often say that it never would have happened if his mother were still alive. She was his anchor, his moral compass. In his final years, as his health declined, he looked more and more like her. He had the same puffiness in his face, the same sad eyes. Some say he was slowly dying of the same broken heart that he believed had killed her. The pressure of his life, the isolation, the feeling of being misunderstood, these were things he felt she was the only one who could have ever truly understood. So whether he said her name out loud on August 16th or not, she was there. She was in the house he bought for her. She was in the pictures on the walls. Like, she was in his DNA. The word mama represents his deepest longing, a longing for safety, for unconditional love, for a time before the fame, before the colonel, before the drugs. A time when he was just Gladys's boy from Tupelo, Mississippi. It was a cry for a home he could never return to. The unanswered questions are deeply personal. Did he feel her presence in his final moments? Did he believe he was going to be with her again? And is it possible that the profound, unresolved grief from her death 19 years earlier was the true underlying cause of his own? And number 13, was this the sound of surrender? "I'm so tired." This is another phrase that captures a state of being more than a specific, recorded quote. but it's a feeling that saturated his final year. The tiredness was more than physical. It was a bone-deep spiritual exhaustion. Look at the photos from his last concert in Indianapolis on June 26, 1977. He is overweight, sweating profusely, his eyes barely open. He still sings with passion. He gives the audience what they want, but you can see the effort, you can see the strain. The schedule was relentless. From the time he came back to live performing in 1969 until his death in 1977, he performed over 1,100 concerts. That's an average of a show every 2.5 days for 8 years. This schedule would be grueling for a healthy 25-year-old. For a man in his early 40s with a shopping list of health problems, it was a death sentence. The travel was brutal, flying from city to city, living in hotel rooms, trying to sleep at odd hours. He was a nocturnal creature by choice, but the demands of the tours forced his body into a constant state of jet lag. Dr. Nick and his team would use a combination of drugs to put him to sleep after a show and another combination to wake him up and get him on stage the next day. This chemical cycle, repeated for years, was wearing him out, but the tiredness was also emotional. He was tired of the persona, tired of the demands. He was famously generous, giving away cars and jewelry to friends and even strangers. But this generosity was also a burden. People always wanted something from him. He was tired of the loneliness. Despite being surrounded by people 24 hours a day, he was profoundly alone. He confided in very few people. He couldn't trust anyone. He felt that everyone, even his friends, was on his payroll. In her book, Elvis and Me, Priscilla Presley describes his deep dissatisfaction with his life, even at the height of his fame. He would have moments of intense clarity where he saw the absurdity and the emptiness of his situation. He was an object, a product to be sold. This awareness was exhausting. To fight it took energy he no longer had. On his last day, he was supposed to be resting before flying out to start another tour. But he wasn't resting, he couldn't sleep, he played racquetball with his cousin Billy Smith in the middle of the night. He sang a few songs at the piano. He was trying to distract himself to burn off the nervous energy. But underneath it all was this profound weariness. He was tired of fighting his body, tired of fighting his image, tired of fighting his own despair. "I'm so tired," was the simple truth of his existence. He was running on empty, and the engine was about to seize. We must ask ourselves, did anyone truly understand the depth of his exhaustion? If he had simply canceled that final tour, citing his health, would it have given him the break he needed to survive? Or was the machine too big to stop, and was his exhaustion the price he had to pay to be the king? Number 12. Was he speaking to God or the Colonel? Forgive me. In his final hours, Elvis sat at the piano in his racquetball building. He played and sang. One of the last songs he ever sang was Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain. It's a sad, gentle country song about loss and the hope of reunion after death. He also reportedly sang some gospel hymns. Gospel music was his first love. It was the music of his childhood church. It was the music that brought him the most comfort. Songs like How Great Thou Art and He Touched Me were staples of his private moments. He won all 3 of his Grammy Awards for his gospel recordings. This music was not a performance for him. It was a prayer. In these songs, he could express the spiritual longing and the sense of sin and redemption that were so central to his worldview. So a phrase like "forgive me" feels authentic to the man he was in those quiet moments. But who was he asking for forgiveness? On one level, he was speaking to God. He was a deeply religious man, though his beliefs were a complex mix of Pentecostal Christianity and Eastern mysticism. He believed in a final judgment. He was acutely aware of his own flaws, his excesses, his temper, his distance from his family. He likely felt he had squandered the divine gift he had been given. He was a sinner looking for grace. But on another level, the plea for forgiveness could have been directed at others. At Priscilla for the failure of their marriage. At Lisa Marie for not being the father he wanted to be. He saw her only periodically, and their time together was often a whirlwind of extravagant gifts rather than normal family life. He may have been asking for forgiveness from his own body, which he had abused for so long. And maybe, in a way, he was asking for forgiveness from his fans. He knew he wasn't the man he used to be. He saw the unflattering photos in the newspapers. He read the bad reviews. He felt he was letting people down. The man who had burst onto the scene in the 1950s with so much energy and beauty was now a shadow of his former self. He might have felt a deep sense of shame, a sense that he had failed to live up to his own legend. The book Elvis, What Happened had laid his sins bare for the world to see. The betrayal he felt was immense, but it must have also forced a moment of self-reflection. The book detailed his drug use, his gun obsession, his volatile behavior. Reading it, or hearing about it, must have been like looking into a distorted mirror. The plea forgive me could have been his response to that ugly reflection. An admission of guilt, a last-ditch hope for redemption. The questions that remain are spiritual and profound. Did he feel forgiven in his last moments? Did his lifelong search for spiritual peace bring him any comfort at the end? Or did he die feeling the full weight of his sins and regrets, with his most important prayer left unanswered? On number 11, was this a cry of despair or a question of physics? It's just the light. Elvis suffered from glaucoma. It's a condition that increases pressure inside the eyeball, causing gradual loss of sight. For a performer whose job is to be seen and to connect with an audience, a threat to his vision was a terrifying prospect. The bright stage lights, which were once his natural habitat, became a source of pain. Friends and associates from his final years recall him complaining about the lights. He would shield his eyes, he would sometimes stumble on stage. The phrase, "it's just the light," could have been a way of dismissing the pain, a way of reassuring himself and others that it was a temporary problem, not a sign of a deeper decay. It was another form of denial. He was a man whose body was failing him in multiple ways, and he was trying to hold it together with sheer willpower. But the phrase can be read in a more symbolic way. Elvis lived his entire adult life in the spotlight. A spotlight so intense it was blinding. He had no privacy. Every meal, every purchase, every relationship was subject to public scrutiny. He couldn't walk down the street. He couldn't go to a movie. He was a prisoner of the light. In this sense, it's just the light could be a statement of profound weariness with the nature of fame itself. The light was the source of his wealth and his power, but it was also the source of his pain and his isolation. It distorted everything. It prevented him from seeing the world clearly, and it prevented the world from seeing him as a real human being. He was an image, a symbol, an icon. The light flattened him, bleached him of his humanity. And Larry Geller wrote about Elvis's fascination with spiritual texts that discussed a different kind of light, the inner light, the divine light, the light of God. Elvis was on a quest to find this spiritual light. He felt it was the only thing that could save him from the empty glare of the spotlights. He was caught between two lights, the artificial light of the stage and the divine light he was searching for. His final hours were spent in the dark. He was a creature of the night. He woke up when the sun went down and went to bed when it came up. He was literally hiding from the light of day. So his complaint about the light is deeply ironic. He engineered his life to avoid the sun, only to be tormented by the artificial suns of the stage. He was a man who craved the darkness, but whose job demanded he stand in the brightest light imaginable. This contradiction was at the heart of his struggle, and so we are left to wonder. Was his complaint about the lights a simple medical symptom, or was it a profound existential cry from a man who had been blinded by his own fame? And in his final moments, in the darkness of that bathroom, did he see any light at all? Number 10, was this his final command? Get me the book. This is a variation on his final known act. Before going to the bathroom, he needed his reading material. The request itself is simple, but it speaks volumes about who he had become. In his youth, his commands would have been different. Get me the car. Get me the guitar. Get me a cheeseburger. But in the end, the thing he wanted most was a book. This command shows the shift in his priorities. The physical world, with all its pleasures, had begun to fail him. The food made him fat. The women came and went. The cars were just metal boxes. The music, at times, felt like a chore. The one thing that still offered him a path to something new was knowledge. Ideas, the spiritual quest contained in the pages of his books, the command also shows his dependence. Elvis was the king, but he was also like a child in many ways. He rarely did anything for himself. He had the Memphis Mafia, his group of friends and employees, to cater to his every whim. If he wanted a glass of water, someone would get it. If he wanted to fly to Denver for a specific kind of sandwich, it would be arranged. This dependence was a part of his isolation. He was so insulated from the normal tasks of life that he lost the ability to navigate them. His request for the book was likely made to Ginger, but it could have been made to anyone who was nearby. It was the command of a man used to being obeyed, but it was also the plea of a man who was lost. He didn't know how to fix his life, how to heal his body, or how to quiet his mind. So he looked for the answers in a book. He was hoping that some author, some mystic, some prophet had written down the secret, and all he had to do was find the right page. The specific book, The Scientific Search for the Face of Jesus, is key. He wasn't asking for a novel or a history book. He was asking for a book that promised to bridge the gap between faith and science, between the spiritual and the physical. This was the central conflict of his own life. He was a deeply spiritual man living a life of extreme physical indulgence. He was a boy from a poor religious family who had become a god of secular culture. He was trying to reconcile these two halves of himself. He was looking for proof. He was looking for a sign. Get me the book was his final attempt to find it. But what if he had asked for a different book? What if he had asked for a book of poetry or a photo album of his family? Would his final thoughts have been different? Did the book he chose lead his mind down a specific path in those last moments? And what does it say about a man that his last recorded desire was not for a person, but for an object that he hoped held the key to everything? Number 9, what was he trying to hold on to? Lisa, his daughter's name. Lisa Marie Presley. She was only 9 years old when he died. She was his only child, the center of his universe. But his love for her was complicated by his chaotic lifestyle. When he was with her, he showered her with gifts. He bought her a pony. He rented out entire amusement parks for her. He let her stay up all hours. He was a fun, indulgent father. But he wasn't a consistent presence in her life. After his divorce from Priscilla in 1973, he saw Lisa Marie during holidays and summer vacations. Graceland became her personal playground, but it was a strange and artificial environment for a child. There were no rules. The days and nights were reversed. She was surrounded by adults who treated her father like a king. In his final days, Lisa Marie was not at Graceland. She was with her mother in California. But she was never far from his thoughts. Many accounts from his last year mention his conversations about her. He worried about her. He wanted to be a better father. He felt the guilt of their separation. He knew her life was not normal. To speak her name in his final hours, or even just to think it, would have been a natural final thought for any father. It represents his connection to the future, his legacy, his one true, undeniable creation. The one person in the world who was a part of him. In the midst of his spiritual searching and his physical pain, the thought of his daughter would have been an anchor to the real world. A world he was rapidly losing his grip on. The relationship between Elvis and Lisa Marie was intense. She adored him, and he saw a reflection of himself in her. In her book, Priscilla talks about how Elvis would confide in Lisa Marie, treating her more like a friend than a child. This put a lot of pressure on a young girl. She was his Isa, his little princess. But she also saw the darker side. She saw his rages, she saw his weakness. She was a child witness to the decline of the king. Saying her name could have been a moment of regret. Regret for the time lost. Regret for the chaos he had brought into her life. Or it could have been a moment of simple, pure love. A father's final thought for his child. A hope that she would be okay without him. It was his one link to a normal life, a life of family and responsibility, a life he had both craved and rejected. The questions surrounding this are heartbreaking. Did he have any premonition that he was leaving his young daughter behind? What were his final hopes and fears for her future in a world that would never let her forget she was Elvis Presley's daughter? And how did the trauma of his death at such a young age shape the rest of her own tragic life? Number 8, was he afraid of what came next? What's the point? This is the voice of despair, the ultimate question of a man who has everything and feels nothing. By 1977, Elvis had achieved every possible measure of success. He had sold more records than any artist in history. He was one of the most famous people on the planet. He had unlimited wealth, but he was deeply, profoundly unhappy. The nihilism of this question would have been a constant undercurrent in his final year. What was the point of another tour? He didn't need the money. The performances were physically torturous and often creatively unsatisfying. What was the point of another day? His days were spent in a drug-induced fog, isolated from the real world, surrounded by people who were paid to be his friends. This sense of pointlessness is a classic symptom of depression, and it's clear from many accounts that Elvis suffered from it. His mood swings were legendary. He could be joyful and generous one moment, and angry and paranoid the next. He would lock himself in his room for days. He was a man struggling with deep emotional pain, and he was using prescription drugs to numb it. But the numbness only led to a greater sense of emptiness. the book Elvis: What Happened. For someone as concerned with his image as Elvis, this would have been a devastating blow. It would have made him feel that all his work, all his art, all his generosity had been for nothing, that his legacy was being destroyed while he was still alive. This could easily lead to the question, what's the point? If this is what it all comes to, why go on? Peter Guralnick's biography details Elvis's growing detachment from reality. He lived in a world where his every whim was catered to, but this also meant he had no real challenges, no real purpose beyond maintaining the Elvis machine. He had conquered the world and now he was bored. The thrill of the climb was gone, and he was left alone at the summit with nowhere else to go. The question, what's the point, is the antithesis of his youthful ambition. The young Elvis was all-purpose. He wanted to get his family out of poverty. He wanted to buy his mother a Cadillac. He wanted to be a star. He achieved all of that and more before he was 25. He spent the next 20 years living in the aftermath of his own success, and he discovered that achieving all your dreams can be its own kind of nightmare. This leads to some of the darkest questions. Had he truly given up hope? Was his death an accident, or was it the result of a long, slow, passive suicide? Was he just too tired to see the point in trying to save himself anymore? Number 7, was this his final business negotiation? Tell the Colonel. Colonel Tom Parker was the architect of Elvis's career here. He was his manager, his promoter, his protector, and some would say his jailer. Their relationship was one of the most complex and controversial in music history. The Colonel discovered Elvis when he was a young, raw talent and turned him into a global brand. He was a master negotiator and a brilliant marketer, but he also took an unprecedented 50% of Elvis's earnings. Their relationship was built on a strange codependence. Elvis trusted the Colonel implicitly, at least in the early years. The Colonel was a father figure to him, but the Colonel also controlled him completely. He chose the movie scripts. He set the tour schedules, he made the deals. He famously never allowed Elvis to tour outside of North America. The reason, it was later discovered, was that the Colonel was an illegal immigrant from the Netherlands, and he was afraid he would not be allowed back into the US if he left. By 1977, the relationship had soured. Elvis felt stifled. He resented the bad movies. He was furious about the failed A Star Is Born deal. He knew the Colonel saw him as a cash cow, not an artist. There were moments when Elvis threatened to fire him, but he never went through with it. He was too dependent, too scared of what life would be like without the Colonel pulling the strings. So, in his final hours, what might he have wanted to tell the Colonel? It could have been a message of defiance. And tell the Colonel the tour's off. Tell the Colonel I'm done. It could have been his final desperate attempt to break free. A last-minute rebellion against the man who had controlled his destiny for over 2 decades. Or it could have been the opposite. It could have been a message of submission. Tell the Colonel I'm ready for the tour. Tell the Colonel everything is fine. It could have been the words of a man who knew he was trapped and was simply reporting for duty one last time. Given his state of mind and health, this seems just as plausible. He was a soldier in the Colonel's army, and he was falling in line even as it was killing him. The Colonel was in Portland, Maine on August 16th, preparing for the tour to start. When he received the news of Elvis's death, his first reaction was purely business. He got on the phone and started managing the aftermath. He knew that Elvis's death would make the brand more valuable than ever. It was a cold, calculating response to a human tragedy. It revealed the true nature of their relationship. It was never about love or art. It was about money. And so we are left with the great what-if of Elvis's career. What if he had fired the Colonel? Would he have made better movies, created more meaningful music, and maybe even saved his own life? Or was the Colonel the only one who could handle the chaos of Elvis's fame? And without him, would Elvis have self-destructed even sooner? Number 6, was he saying goodbye to a ghost? Priscilla. Her name would have been a complex one on his lips. Priscilla Beaulieu Presley. He met her when she was just 14. He was 24, serving in the army in Germany. He courted her, brought her to Graceland, and married her in 1967. She was the mother of his child. She was the only woman he ever married. But their love story was not a fairy tale. He molded her into his ideal woman. He dictated her hair color, her clothes, her makeup. She lived in his world, by his rules, In her book, Elvis and Me, she describes a life of deep love, but also of profound loneliness. He was often on the road, he had affairs, she was left alone at Graceland, a young woman in a gilded cage. They divorced in 1973. The split was amicable, and they remained close friends. In some ways, their relationship was better after the divorce. The pressure was off. They could be honest with each other. He still loved her. He would sometimes call her late at night, pouring his heart out. He would ask her to come back. He never seemed to fully accept that their marriage was over. For Elvis, Priscilla represented a stability he had lost. She was the keeper of his home, the mother of his child. She was a link to a time when he was happier, healthier. He had driven her away with his infidelity and his erratic behavior, and he regretted it. Ginger Alden was his fiancée, but many in Elvis's circle believed he was never truly over Priscilla. He was just trying to fill the void she had left. To say her name in his final moments would have been to acknowledge this great, unresolved loss in his life. It would have been a recognition that his dream of a perfect family had failed. He was the king of rock and roll, but he couldn't keep his own queen. This failure haunted him. On the day he died, Priscilla was in Los Angeles. She received the news and was devastated. She was the one who had to tell Lisa Marie that her father was gone. In the years that followed, it was Priscilla who took control of his estate, who opened Graceland to the public, and who secured his legacy for future generations. In a strange way, she became his most effective partner only after his death. But what did her name truly mean to him at the very end? Was it a plea for reconciliation? A final admission of love and regret? Or was it just the memory of a happier time, a ghost from a past he could never reclaim? And did he realize in that final moment that the love he had lost was the one thing his money and fame could never buy back? Number 5, was this a confession of his deepest fear? I'm lonely. It is the great paradox of Elvis Presley's life. He was one of the most loved and desired men in the world, yet he was crushingly lonely. He was constantly surrounded by his entourage, the Memphis Mafia. They were his friends, his employees, his bodyguards, his companions. They lived with him, traveled with him, and were on call 24/7. But this constant presence was a barrier, not a cure for loneliness. The relationships were not equal. He was the boss. He paid their salaries. This created an unbridgeable gap. They were unlikely to challenge him or tell him hard truths. They were enablers, whether they meant to be or not. He could have a room full of people and still be completely alone with his thoughts and his fears. His romantic relationships also failed to cure his loneliness. He loved women, and they loved him. But the relationships often followed a pattern, an intense period of courtship, followed by a period where he would grow distant and seek comfort elsewhere. He was searching for the perfect love, the unconditional acceptance he had with his mother, and he never found it. He was looking for someone to save him, but he was also incapable of letting anyone truly get close enough to do so. Fame itself is an isolating force. It separates you from normal human experience. Elvis couldn't go to the grocery store. He couldn't take a walk in the park. He couldn't sit in a restaurant without causing a riot. His world was Graceland. It was a beautiful prison. He was a king in a kingdom of one. In his final years, this loneliness was acute. His health was failing. His creative spirit was dimming. He felt misunderstood. He would stay up all night, reading his spiritual books, searching for a connection to something beyond himself. This was a lonely quest. He could talk about it with Larry Geller, but ultimately it was a journey he had to take alone. The statement, "I'm lonely," is the simple, tragic truth at the heart of the Elvis myth. The world saw the confident, charismatic star, but the man himself was often a small, scared boy longing for a genuine connection. On his last night, he was with his fiancée. He had friends downstairs. He was hours away from being greeted by thousands of adoring fans in Maine. And yet, he could still have felt completely and utterly alone. The most shocking questions are about those around him. Did they see his loneliness, or did they only see the king? Could any of them have broken through the wall of fame and money to offer him true friendship? Or was his loneliness an incurable side effect of the life he had chosen? Number 4, was this a final act of defiance? I can't. These two words can be read in two completely opposite ways. They can be a cry of surrender. I can't go on. I can't do another tour. I can't fight this anymore. This is the voice of a man who has reached his limit. A man whose body and spirit are broken. Given his physical condition and his state of mind, this interpretation is painfully easy to believe. He was at the end of his rope, but there is another way to hear these words. I can't, as in, I can't fail. I can't let them see me this way. I can't give up. This is the voice of his pride, his defiance. Elvis was an incredibly proud man. He was proud of his talent, proud of his success, proud of his image. The idea of failing, of becoming a joke, was terrifying to him. The publication of Elvis What Happened was a direct assault on this pride. It exposed his secrets. It showed him at his worst. His reaction was a mixture of rage and shame. He wanted to prove the book wrong. He wanted to get back on stage and show the world that he was still the king. The upcoming tour was his chance to do that. He was on a diet. He was trying to get in shape. He was fighting back. So, I can't could have been part of an internal monologue. A struggle between the part of him that wanted to give up and the part that refused to be defeated. He had overcome poverty. He had overcome the critics who called his music vulgar. He had overcome the army. He had overcome Hollywood. He was a fighter. Maybe, in his last hours, he was still fighting. But think about him playing racquetball in the middle of the night. It was 4 a.m. He was with his cousin Billy Smith and their wives. He was laughing and playing, but the game was cut short when he clumsily hit himself with the racket, a small uncoordinated moment that might have reminded him of his body's betrayal. Even in a moment of distraction, his physical limitations were there. The struggle between I can't go on and I can't give up was the central drama of his final year. He was simultaneously self-destructing and trying to save himself. He was taking drugs that were killing him while also reading books about spiritual healing. He was a man at war with himself, and on August 16, 1977, that war reached its devastating conclusion. This leaves us with the ultimate chicken and egg question. Did his pride prevent him from asking for the help he so desperately needed? Or was it that same pride the only thing that kept him going for as long as he did? And in the end, which side won? Number 3, was he thinking about his place in history? Remember me, no one heard him say this, but it is the unspoken desire of every great artist. It is the hope that your work will outlive you, that your voice will not be silenced by death. For Elvis, the question of his legacy would have been a pressing concern in his final years. He had already changed the world. He was the flashpoint for a cultural revolution. He fused black and white music. He brought a dangerous sexual energy to the mainstream. He was the first true rock and roll superstar. His place in the history of the 20th century was secure. But he may not have seen it that way. By 1977, the musical landscape had changed. Punk rock was exploding in London and New York. Disco dominated the charts. The raw, rebellious sound that Elvis had pioneered was now part of the establishment. To a new generation, he was a Las Vegas entertainer in a gaudy jumpsuit, a nostalgic act. This must have been painful for him. He was a man of immense musical knowledge and taste. He loved all kinds of music, from opera to country to blues. He was frustrated by the perception of him as just a rock and roll singer. He wanted to be seen as a serious artist. His Grammy Awards were for his gospel music, a fact that gave him great pride. It was a sign that, the industry respected his vocal talent, not just his image. The desire to be remembered, and to be remembered for the right things, is a powerful motivator. It might have been what drove him to keep touring, even when he was sick. He wanted to connect with his audience. Oh, he wanted to feel their love. It was a validation that he still mattered. He also had a more personal legacy in mind, his daughter, Lisa Marie. He wanted her to be proud of him. He wanted her to know the man, not just the myth. This is a desire all parents share. But for Elvis, the myth was so large it threatened to swallow the man whole. His death, in a way, was the final dramatic act that secured his legacy forever. It froze him in time. It turned him from a fading star into a timeless legend. In death, he became bigger than he ever was in life. The desire to remember me was granted in the most absolute and tragic way possible. He would never be forgotten, but what would he think of his legacy today? Would he be pleased with the endless stream of merchandise and the legions of impersonators? Or would he be horrified that the image has once again triumphed over the art? And did he have any idea that his death would not be an ending, but the beginning of a whole new and even stranger chapter in his story? Number 2 was this his final realization. It's time! This is a phrase of acceptance, of resignation, the opposite of I can't. It suggests a premonition, a sense that the end was near. Did Elvis know he was dying? It's a question that has haunted his fans for decades. There is some evidence to suggest he did. In the months before his death, he had his will updated. He had conversations with friends about death and the afterlife. He seemed more introspective, more focused on his spiritual search. His body was giving him constant warning signs. The shortness of breath, the high blood pressure, the chronic pain. He was not a fool. He must have known he was on a dangerous path. His cousin, Billy Smith, who was with him on his last night, has said that Elvis seemed depressed and was talking about his own mortality. He was not the confident king, but a man who seemed to be contemplating the end. He sang the song Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain at the piano, a song whose final lyrics are, "And someday when we meet up yonder, we'll stroll hand in hand again." It's a song about death and reunion. If he did feel it's time, it might have been a moment of strange peace. The struggle was over. The pain of being Elvis Presley, with all its pressures and contradictions, was about to end. For a man who had been fighting his own body for so long, the idea of surrender might have been a relief. This idea is controversial. It flirts with the idea of suicide, which most who knew him reject. They say he had too much to live for. He was excited about the tour. He was in love with Ginger. He adored his daughter. But a sense of resignation is not the same as a desire to die. It can be a simple recognition of the inevitable, a moment of clarity in the fog of drugs and pain. He had pushed his body to its absolute limit, and he knew the breaking point was here. His deep spiritual belief might have played a role. He believed in an afterlife. He believed he would be reunited with his mother. For him, death was not a final ending, but a transition. For a journey home, this belief might have given him a sense of calm in the face of what was coming. Its time could have been his signal that he was ready to make that journey. The final questions here are the most profound. If he did know he was dying, why didn't he call a doctor? Was his acceptance so complete that he chose to face it alone? Or was the final event so sudden, so catastrophic, that it took him by surprise, despite all the warnings his body had given him? Number 1. Was this his final, unspoken word? Silence. The most cryptic word of all is the one that is never spoken. After "I'm going to the bathroom to read," there was only silence. It was in that silence that the story of Elvis Presley, the living man, came to an end. It is in that silence that all our questions and theories and speculations must ultimately rest. We can analyze the toxicology reports, we can read the biographies, we can listen to the accounts of those who were there. But we can never know what was in his mind in those final, solitary moments. The silence is a blank page, and on that page we write our own versions of Elvis. The tragic victim, the self-destructive artist, the spiritual seeker, the lonely boy from Tupelo. The silence represents the ultimate privacy that he had been denied for his entire adult life. In death, he finally found a room where the cameras and the fans and the entourage could not follow. A place where he could be completely and finally alone. The circumstances of his death are almost too symbolic. He died on the toilet, like a common man, the king on his throne. It was a mundane, undignified end for a man who had lived such an extraordinary life. But it was also a profoundly human end. It stripped away the jumpsuit, the gold records, and the legend, and left only a mortal man. The silence that followed was quickly filled with noise, the noise of the ambulance sirens, the noise of the media reporting his death, the noise of a world in mourning. That noise has never really stopped. The Elvis industry continues to this day. His voice is still on the radio. His image is still everywhere. But the man himself is gone, and he took his final thoughts with him into that final silence. All these alleged last words, from the documented to the imagined, are our attempts to fill that silence, to make sense of a death that felt so senseless, to understand how a man who had so much could end up with so little. We want to believe that his final words held a key, a final piece of the puzzle. But maybe there is no key. Maybe the silence itself is the message. A final, stark reminder that behind every legend, there is a human being. And every human life, no matter how loud, ends in the same quiet way. And so the final and most shocking question of all. What if there were no cryptic last words? What if his last thought was not about God, or his mother, or his legacy, but about something completely ordinary? A line from a song, a grocery list, a half-forgotten joke. What if, in the end, there was no mystery at all? Just a tired, sick man whose heart simply gave out. Would that be the most tragic story of all?